In 1975, Arneson compiled as much information as he had on his setting into a supplement for D&D called the Blackmore Supplement. A year later, he was formally hired on by TSR, but disagreement over his royalty was already causing problems. He left TSR by the end of 1976, and though he would briefly work with them again by 1980, his time there was short, and this is really the end of his major involvement in the story to come. From here, he would go into teaching, first helping children with special needs in California, then going on to be a teacher at Full Sail University in Florida, until around 2008. While he was there, he taught classes on code documentation and game design. Eventually, he passed away in 2009. Dungeons and Dragons sales exploded through the 1970s, but in 1979 the game's popularity would be sent through the stratosphere. This was, unfortunately, thanks to a tragedy. There will be some discussion of suicide going forward, so please skip a bit ahead if you're unprepared for that. I'll put a time code on screen. James Dallas Egbert III was a young student at Michigan College. He entered college when he was just 14 years old, and the newspapers of his time all make a point of talking about how high his IQ was, a concept thoroughly discredited in the 5 decades since. When he was 17, he told his roommate he was a homosexual. His roommate left their shared room because of this. His parents also claimed he'd gotten into drinking and drugs, and it was also said that his parents were extremely strict, and he was suffering under the extreme pressure they had put on him. A teenager already in college, outside of his element, this cocktail of stressors compiled to ultimately pressure the young man to attempt suicide. Fortunately, he failed, but after this failed attempt, he ran away. After being missing for 5 days, the school contacted his parents and they contacted William Deere. William Deere is, in my estimation, the worst sort of scumbag in the world. He's an ambulance chaser and a media attention seeker. He heard that some kids went into the sewers beneath Michigan and that Egbert played D&D, and from that extrapolated, seemingly out of his own ass, that people would sometimes get stuck in character and lose themselves. He fed this story to the media, and this led to a total media firestorm that swept the entire nation. Everyone was instantly hooked on the idea that this game kids are playing in dark sewers can consume their personality and drive them to some sort of fugue state, wandering off into the night. This, combined with an already growing concern about the game involving demons, and soon the satanic panic was in full swing across the nation. William Deere eventually wrote a revisionist bit of history called Dungeon Master, where he drastically downplayed the role of games in James's disappearance. But the damage was done, and also he named the damn thing Dungeon Master, so clearly he was still capitalizing on the D&D angle. I don't think that Deere's involvement led to Egbert's eventual death by suicide, but I also don't think what a young queer youth in the middle of a depressive episode needed was to be blasted across every TV in the country at the center of a controversy arising from a false story constructed out of thin air. I think that's probably pretty bad. His parents would later say of the incident that it was actually surprisingly simple. He just went as far as his money would take him. Of course, that's not the story that the country was told, and by the time they were told the real story, it was already too late.
I'm actually kind of surprised about the stuck in character angle. I never
Yeah.
heard that before. And like
Yeah.
it's got to be from the that whole like the D&D satanic like panic thing, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because like did anyone ever say that about like actors or
Yeah.
dancers throughout history?
Also, this is completely unrelated, but William Deere is still up to this shit. His most recent effort to chase clout is a book he wrote about how he'd solved the O.J. Simpson case, and I just kinda hate this guy, okay? Ironically, this firestorm did not hurt D&D. It catapulted it into superstardom. The game became a major fad across the country, quadrupling from 2 million in sales in 1979 to 8.7 million in 1980, with over 6 million in the first quarter of 1981. Suddenly, there weren't many closed doors to Dungeons and Dragons. Video games, toys, figures, miniatures, movies, and cartoons all suddenly became very realistic overnight. At this time, two children of Mildred Marmer, vice president of subsidiary rights at Random House, begged her to get involved with TSR. They were massive fans of the game. This would get D&D into book retailers across the country. Gary flew out to New York to hammer out the deal. As part of this arrangement, they entered into a special agreement. Random House would lend them about 30% of the book order sales up front, and then, when the books sold, TSR would pay it back. This allowed TSR tremendous flexibility in a time where it needed cash up front the most. After all, they weren't having a very good time getting loans from banks. This deal was actually extremely good for TSR, but if they ever failed to pay back the loan, well, let me just set a little bomb over here. And so long as we all keep our eye on the bomb, it'll never go off. In 1977, Gygax tasked many of his new staff writers with helping him organize his notes and thoughts for a new edition. All of these writers are credited as editors or in the special thanks section in the actual books, not as designers and certainly not as the writer. This new edition would address long-standing confusion around the rules and answer many of the questions DMs had been calling Gary Gygax at his own home to ask him about. And so, in 1977, the first book of Advanced Dungeons & Dragons alongside Basic Dungeons & Dragons was released. However, he was not content to just roll out a new product. He also decided this was a good time to cut Arneson out entirely. He argued that AD&D was sufficiently different to the original Dungeons & Dragons that Arneson should not receive royalties from it. Instead, Arneson would receive royalties from the basic edition of Dungeons & Dragons, which Gary Gygax assumed would sell much worse. Arneson took the issue to the courts, beginning the first of many legal battles between the co-creators of Dungeons & Dragons. And as for who he had help him create the new versions of Dungeons & Dragons, at first he relied heavily on Tim Kask, but eventually Kask would move on to other projects, and eventually he'd leave the company entirely. Unbeknownst to pretty much anyone at the time, Gary already had an idea brewing in his head for a D&D movie, and he needed someone at the company who could keep work on the game going so he could pursue that. For this task, he tapped the inimitable Frank Mincer. Frank Mincer was a dungeon master for his friend group. One friend had seen an ad for a designer and editor in Dragon magazine. Mincer had to be talked into applying, but when he did apply, he ultimately managed to get the editor role. He worked on a prodigious amount of titles, quickly showing skills in both editing and design. He was rapidly tapped for the most extensive editing projects in the company. But he not only excelled in work. In his brief time with TSR, he gained acclaim as a skilled dungeon master. TSR was holding a Dungeon Master Invitational, and he entered and won. So these were like competitive D&D tournaments.
Competitive D&D? Mm-hmm. Ranked competitive D&D?
Exactly.
Am I a casual D&D player?
This achievement eventually earned him the notice of Mike Carr. Until now, TSR had been running, organizing, and hosting tournaments at conventions, but as crunch got tighter at the office, TSR wanted to offload this responsibility onto an organized play committee. Mike Carr nominated Frank Mincer to organize this effort. Frank found that organized play tended to reward the people who stayed quiet and stuck to completing game-like objectives. He wanted to shake it up and put the focus back on roleplay. He established a system whereby DMs and players would vote on the best roleplayer at their table, and that would enhance their score. Thus, he formed the Role-Playing Games Association. This association became TSR's organized play arm, and continues even to this day by the name of the Adventures League. But TSR was determined to prove that it wasn't a real company, because rather than releasing all 3 books at once like any normal company would do, they released them scattered out across 3 years, releasing the Monster Manual in 1977, the PHB in 1978, and the DMG in 1979. But several key components of how to play the game were in the DMG. For an entire year, clerics had the power to turn undead, but no rules on how it worked. This just isn't a real company. During this time of aggressive hiring, one of the new employees was Gene Wells. Gene Wells saw an advertisement for a designer position and applied for it around 1980 when TSR was in its boom period. Gary had her flown out to his home for 3 days, where he quickly surmised that she did not know how to do the job, but he hired her anyway. She suspected it was at least in part because she was a woman. Gary promised to teach her the ropes, but as soon as she got hired, he got way too busy and never got around to it. Fortunately, another employee, Skip Williams, took her under his wing, but she didn't need much. She'd soon distinguish herself as a talented editor, designer, and writer. Eventually, she became the sage in Sage Advice and gained a reputation for funny, witty responses to questions. However, I don't think she was just funny. I think she was also a really good game master. She was part of the early effort with Frank Mincer to establish the RPGA, and a lot of her advice was centered from the perspective of communicating with your players, not taking the game too seriously, and enjoying the narrative aspects of the game. Eventually, she was tapped to write an adventure module and released The Palace of the Silver Princess. The artist's art had characters of people in the design department, which management interpreted as mocking them. They also called an image of a woman bound by her hair as bondage, and pulled the entire adventure after it was printed, even though everything had already been approved several times previously. Having seen the art myself and showing you the art now, I don't really think it was anything worse than the stuff they usually featured. This was obviously a reaction to the growing satanic panic. The furor surrounding the missing James Dallas Egbert had morphed over time into a sort of cultural war against the youth and the things they liked. In this situation, it was Jean Wells who caught the brunt of it. After this costly fiasco, Jean found that no one wanted her writing adventures anymore. The same wasn't true for her boss who'd approved her work, or the artist who had drawn the objectionable materials. All the blame fell squarely on Jean Wells. I wonder why that could be. They consigned her to secretarial work. This work was not at all what Jean wanted, and she resigned, a victim of an increasingly hostile workplace, a culture war, and sexism. She wasn't the only one to suffer this fate. Let's talk about Darlene. One of the coolest people I've never met, Darlene. She had her name legally changed to just Darlene, but spelled with a single large capital D and the rest in small capital letters. She went to London to study calligraphy under Queen Elizabeth's scribe. When she was hired in 1980, there was a company policy against women artists. However, Tim Cass didn't care. He needed an artist for Dragon magazine, and he liked her art. She was brought in 1980. Perhaps her most famous work was designing the TSR logo. Obviously, you can see a bit of calligraphy in here, as well as the very elegant and clean work here. However, the piece I think which impacted the game most was her Greyhawk map. It's a gorgeous map, and even showing it to you now, this version of the image is a crime. The actual thing in person is staggering in its size and complexity. Please go look up Darlene's Greyhawk map. I don't think it's an exaggeration to say it sets the style, tone, and bar for basically every D&D map to come after it. Gary Gygax said the map was born perfect, and for once, I'm inclined to agree with the man. Darlene found that when she asked to be promoted to a full-time artist for the company, they always had some excuse or another. Usually the fact she wasn't a gamer was thrown back at her. Eventually, she realized they were never going to hire her full-time as an artist because she was a woman. By then, Tim Cass had already left, and she left soon after.
That map, is that now, I did look up that map.
Uh-huh.
As you were talking.
As you should, yes. Darlene's incredible map.
It's a hex map from what it looks like?
Correct, yeah. All maps of that era were kind of done in the hex style.
Mm-hmm. Oh, gorgeous from what
it is, right? I mean, to
also,
think that that's her first
detail.
map.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And it must have been drawn, I guess, traditionally, right?
Yeah, exactly. There's no computer illustration at this time. This is 1978, 1979. She hand drew that in her floor.
God, the lettering's beautiful.
Right? I mean, she's a traditionally trained calligrapher, so she's incredibly skilled at that sort of thing. Yeah. I mean, Darlene is by far one of my favorite people. A thing I didn't mention in the script, but I think is really funny, really interesting. One day, eventually, somebody tried to restart TSR, calling it New TSR, and they reached out to her. And she said that if they wanted to take the name TSR, they first had to apologize for the way that TSR had treated its employees and its customers. And that was the only way that they could take the new TSR name, which I think is pretty baller. Yeah. Pretty cool. Robert Kuntz was a local gamer of Lake Geneva and had been there with Gary when Dave Arneson first demonstrated Blackmore. He was the 6th employee of TSR, brought in to handle shipping originally. Because TSR was so small, basically everyone ended up with design responsibilities. As a regular in Gary's games, he helped work on the Greyhawk supplement, and he co-authored Gods, Demigods, and Heroes. Gary credits him as lending substantial ideas to Expedition at the Barrier Peaks, which we'll never know what that actually means because they didn't credit writers back then. He was the first player to successfully navigate the Tomb of Horrors, and because of his creativity, he was made co-DM for the Greyhawk setting, which was Gary Gygax's personal home setting. Eventually, he started asking to be moved over from editorial to full-time design. However, TSR refused. After a while of getting refused on this promotion, he decided to strike out on his own. He continued working as a designer, releasing adventure modules published by TSR and Paizo. Many years later, in 2005, he was tapped by Gygax to prepare Castle Greyhawk for publication. Because TSR and subsequently WotC owned the rights to the Greyhawk setting, they changed the name to Castle Zagig, which is Gygax spelled backwards. A location gamers had only heard about from 1975 was now finally in print publication, and that was thanks to Kuntz. And, just as a small aside, his brother, Terry Kuntz, worked at the TSR game store and developed their fairly famous hobby shop dungeon, which people would often run as they came into the store. Terry Kuntz is also credited with being the one to originally create the Beholder. But, while Advanced Dungeons & Dragons was establishing itself, a second version of D&D was also being released. This one wasn't aimed at gamers. It was aimed at people who'd never played a war game in their life. Next time, we'll get back to basics. Wait, oh, shit, the bomb. Oh, okay, good. We're still good. Nobody forget the bomb, okay? For now, though, you've sent me a very wonderful little guy.
I've sent you a trash elf.
Oh my god. Kat, I need you to observe the sheet right behind the little man's head. It's a second edition. We've been using a second edition.
Oh no!
Sheet this whole time. But it still works, so...
Whoops.
But that may explain a couple of things that we weren't able to find perfect matches for.
Yeah, that would.
That's okay. So... As is tradition, we make a character in every edition of the game. We've been using the Advanced Dungeons & Dragons rules, and we sat here
Not the character sheet.
And bashed out a character, which I think is a pretty charming little fellow. And
he's not charming. Look at his charisma.
This art you do is so good. So good.
They didn't give a little space for it on this sheet. I was slightly disappointed.
So yeah, we rolled for stats in order again, even though we don't necessarily have to do that with this edition. 14 strength, 16 dex, 8 con. That's after the modifier for being an elf. And then 14 int, 11 whiz, 10 charisma.
It was
armor class of
6. Lose the lowest.
Armor class of 5, which I'm pretty impressed by. I think this is a big upgrade from our AD&D character, right? We had an armor class of 7, I want to say.
It might have been 6 because I can't remember. No, we didn't have a shield. So
yeah, I think we were 7 in that edition. Yeah. So a nice little upgrade for us, which is very pleasant. Wounds, emotional trauma from tragic, edgy backstory.
Listen, I'm an evil assassin. Because in order to be an assassin, you must be evil.
Oh, right. So we've gone for the thief kind of subclass assassin here.
Yes.
Because you did qualify for it with your slightly above average dexterity.
Strength,
or you wanted to avoid thief because you'd already done that. But then you rolled your best stat in dex again.
I might as well take it again, yeah.
Yeah. I love that the book tells you that you should have 2 15s to even really make a character. But the stat generation method does not lend itself to 2 15s.
It doesn't. You just keep rolling, throw the character sheet out, start a new one.
Yes, exactly. That's what they did back then.
Yeah, that was one of the because we looked at the different rolling methods, and one of them was roll 12 characters and pick the best one.
Yeah. There were some truly wild character generation methods. I believe one was roll 12 characters and then oh my god. Then there was another one that was roll 6 sets of stats.
Yeah, 6 sets for each one and pick the best, and it's
at that point just have all 18s. What are we doing here? I love the level of detail you went to with this because let me scroll down for the fine folks at home. Look at all this. Look at all this. Hang on. I need to go up a little.
Well, there's, granted, this was a second edition, sheet. Whoops.
Yes,
but there was no room for items and stuff.
Well,
and
even in second edition, you had items, right? So they should have still had space for it, but there really wasn't. The dedication here to actually doing it right, spending all your gold, getting all your starting gear. I kept telling Kat, you don't have to do all this, it's fine. And Kat was like, no, I'm going to do it right. And I respect it.
I bought
Um,
5 songbirds. They will be
five
my distraction, so I can sneak up and backstab my enemies for double the dice damage.
boots 2 GP, oil 2 GP,
I gotta set
shield.
things on fire.
We got 25 arrows and a
We took
quiver.
a horse. I was surprised
We
a
did take
horse. I guess a riding horse was only like 25
25, yeah.
gold.
The much more expensive one was like a war horse, but
Yes.
a riding horse is only 25
We're
GP.
Skyrim archering this a little bit.
Absolutely. But yeah, I mean, I'm frankly thrilled at the character sheet once again. I don't know what it is, but all these little items down here at the bottom give me such pleasure. They make
Well,
me so
the
happy.
one thing I wanted to make sure I did with the items and the weapons,
Mhm.
because after we picked assassin,
Mhm.
I had to go back and I had to look at what my species was going to be because that could have potentially blocked certain classes for
Mhm.
me. And I think actually the thing that I guess not bothered me the most, yeah, bothered me the most about character creation, was that like just all the restrictions. First, you're rolling your stats. Granted, we did like the
Mhm.
most restrictive stat rolling of you roll them in order and
Well,
you don't
sure. Yeah, we
roll
wanted to kind
7
of like
million
we did
times.
that specifically because we wanted to kind
Yeah,
of like randomize what class we ended up in, so we could kind of get some
yeah.
variety and
But
yeah.
still, with that, with all the limitations on
Mhm.
classes, it's like I have enough wisdom to be a cleric, which, you know, in nowadays D&D, I would never want to be a cleric with 11 wisdom. Cannot
Yeah.
be a half-orc bard, because half-orcs can't have more than 14 wisdom, and you need 15 to be a bard.
Hmm. Oh, and also like the alignment has to be evil on assassin
Yeah.
is just silly. Like, come on, get off my dick. Fuck you. Yeah, but I do think like a lot of the stat caps, especially for like the base classes, are low enough that you can
Yeah.
kind of make any of them with any set of stats. But obviously, you're going to be hugely advantaged if you pick the big stats in the right areas. Like you're going to get more experience points. You're going to get a much bigger to hit at the things that you
Yeah.
do. You're going to know more spells. And I think like for wizards, like you literally can't know spells beyond a certain level without a certain intelligence.
And you have like less of a chance.
Hmm.
Well, I guess that's wisdom, the
Yeah, the
spell
wisdom
fail,
increases spell failure chance. Yeah.
which very much does feel a little like wild magic sorcery kind of
Hmm.
backfiring in your face to me.
Yeah, and but I think like the biggest impediment of it for me is the flipping back and forth it introduces to character creation. Like
Mhm.
in order to pick my class, I need to know my stats and what limitations my stats impose on my class, but also my race has limitations that it imposes on my
Yes.
stats. And so you have to like qualify for three different things, and you're just like flipping back and forth, and it's not very well laid out. I mean, like,
Yeah,
it's better laid out than the OD&D book, but it's still not good. Like,
because I had made myself a halfling for the
hmm
OD&D. I wanted to avoid that for, you know, this
hmm
one, especially because I was going thief again.
yeah,
I mean, I guess there's something to be said for make the same character, you know, throughout the ages of
hmm
D&D, but
yeah, sure.
that
See
was
how it
not this.
changes. Yeah.
But those were the only options that had like a plus to dexterity, and certain classes at different levels for like each class get like bonuses to experience if you have 16 or 18
hmm
or 14, depends on which one, of a specific score, which, you know, for thief assassin, you know, it was 16, or you needed greater than 15
hmm
dexterity. So to get that, I had to be an elf or a
hmm
halfling.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I really didn't like all the flipping back and forth, and I think the other thing that I would like really feel weird about is how, because they haven't standardized how bonuses come from your stats, each stat has its own table which lists the
Yeah.
specific benefits or negatives to having a good score in that stat. And that is really confusing. And again, it just leads to a lot of flipping back and forth. And, like, for example, you might learn in your dexterity score that you have a modifier to your attack that you then wait, 30 minutes of character creation before you actually get to the point where you get
Yeah.
your modifier to your attack to then apply that bonus. And so it's just very out of order and strange.
One thing
And
that I didn't pay attention to too much because
mhm,
it didn't matter for the scores that we rolled. I don't know if you saw this.
mhm,
There are like opposed to like the minimum wisdoms, if you have a wisdom of 5 or lower, here or lower, the character can only be a thief.
Yeah, that's just pure classism, right? That's just
It's
pure
so
like,
wild though. And then for
uh,
dexterity, 5 or lower, here or lower, you can
mhm.
only be a cleric.
Yeah, it's a
Yes.
very strange game. But yeah, so overall, all things considered, what's the one thing you're taking away from making a advanced Dungeons and Dragons character?
I mean, I think just that with the flipping back and forth, like
Mm-hmm.
trying to make sure. Oh, if I wanted to be an elf for like, let's say we had some story,
Mm-hmm.
Adventurers League, RPGA, role playing aspect to things, right?
Mm-hmm.
And we all, wanted to be, I don't know, dwarves or whatever. Like, I wouldn't have gotten my 16 in Dex because I
Mm-hmm.
had to be an elf to get that, right? Or you could
Mm-hmm.
possibly be locked out of certain classes, like the Bard in the appendix. A little absurd. You need a 15 in like a bajillion things, right? You literally
Yeah.
can't get that as a half orc, and I
I
just
think
think that's wild.
Yeah, I think Paladin is also the same where you just need a
Is
bunch
it
of
as
really
well?
high stats. And yeah, and like the racial limits and the gender limits
Oh my
on
gosh.
stats are gross. They're bad.
Especially, and I think you mentioned it last time,
Hmm.
like with it being said that there won't be a difference
Oh,
between.
I think that was actually when we were
um
just hanging out.
it might
So,
have, yeah.
in the introduction to Advanced Dungeons and Dragons, he specifically calls out there are no arbitrary limits on a woman's strength. And then it has arbitrary limits on a woman's
It's right
strength.
there on the tables,
It's right there. Like, what are you talking?
like a
Like,
few pages away.
it's so clear that he didn't write that part of the book, and that he doesn't know that his own book does impose that arbitrary limit. That's clearly a too many cooks in the kitchen kind of thing, where
Yeah.
between the writing of the preface and the writing of that chart, some information was lost and never got clarified at any point in the editing process. Very strange.
Yeah, the limits on strength, well, and because the limits on
Hmm.
strength also correspond to some of the not the saving throws.
Hmm.
Saving throws are something I can't know about because it was in a different book.
Yeah, that's another
Uh,
really fucked up thing in this edition is like half the rules are kind of carved out. Like what should be player facing rules are carved out and sent to the DMG. And then there's actually specific advice in the DMG to undercut player features.
yeah, no
Like we
poison, no
Yeah,
poison for me.
could you talk about that for a second, cuz I think that's wild.
Yeah, because originally when we were looking at Assassin, and I saw because Assassin has rules for poison weapon and people noticing poison weapons. Like every round of combat, there is a cumulative. Like if there's two
Mhm.
enemies, they have a 10% chance on the first round to, hey, that's a poison weapon, and then there is a percentile table on do they attack you, call for a guard, or do both.
Yeah.
But then the next round, it's 20%, and then 30%, and 40%, each and every kind of go around the combat round. But then everywhere else, it's like, actually, poison's really hard to use
Mhm.
because you have to learn from someone who already knows how to do it. Takes several weeks and like thousands of gold
Yeah, and
to learn.
you're advised to like check to see if they nick themselves at any time during the process and poison themselves. And you're supposed to impose all these limitations. The DMG makes it seem very much like it is like, don't let them use poison. Make it as big of a pain in the ass as possible. It literally tells you don't even suggest that making poison is possible. They have to come up with it on their own idea because it so clearly does not want players to have poison. Then why did you make it such a prominent part
Yeah,
of
it
the
should have been
class?
made a There might have been people who are like, "Oh yeah, like roleplay wise, I want to use that poison and put it on my blade, so when I stabby, it do more."
Hmm. And then
But
you're
it's like,
supposed to be
no.
like, well, okay, but to check to see if you nick yourself. Oh, you failed the poison save, you die. Like,
Yeah,
point. Just such. This is the like base core of adversarial DMing. I feel
yeah.
like this is such a like the game is trying very hard to like pretend it's very permissive, and then in the background be like, no, actually, don't do this. It's fucked up.
The one
Yeah.
last thing for the assassin that we didn't note.
Mm-hmm.
And I put these at the bottom of the sheet because,
Oh,
again, we
yeah.
used the wrong sheet. It's whatever.
Hang on, let me get these. Yeah, okay.
With the well, as an elf, I get a plus to short swords and bows, which was neat.
Mm-hmm.
Skyrim archer time,
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
But a sneak attack as a thief, if the enemy's surprised, you can sometimes just insta kill someone.
Yeah,
Ju-
like if you're a level 1 character fighting a level 1 enemy, you have a 50% chance of just they're dead.
If they're surprised, if they're surprised.
If they're surprised, yeah.
But you're pretty good at sneaking usually. You know.
And as an elf, you have a ability
Yes.
to surprise 66% of the time.
Yes, that's if you're an elf with either a bunch of elves and halflings, or you're 90 feet ahead of your party.
Yeah. So, that I'm sure that there were some times where that broke great and it was extremely fun. And I'm sure that there were times where that broke so bad.
I find it funny that elves are worse at opening. I had a -5% as an elf to open a lock. Probably because, again, there's no doors, apparently.
There's no doors.
No doors, no locks.
In Elf Town, they ain't got doors. All right, Ailoth, thank you very much for joining me for another journey through the edition. We're really getting into the meat of the things now. Next time we're going to be talking about D&D Basic. I hope you will subscribe and tune in for that because I really enjoy making these. And Ailoth, I hope you enjoyed hearing the story and being here for it.
Yeah.
All right, have a good one. Bye.
Bye.